Welcome to the Project Production Institute's virtual conference on how to achieve project objectives during COVID-19. Thanks for being here. We are glad you could join us for what is sure to be a great conversation with our panelists. My name is Kristen Bittner. I'm part of the team here at PPI, and I will be helping to moderate this panel. Before we introduce our speakers, a quick logistics note. This will be an interactive session, so please post your questions in our question box throughout the panel presentation, and we will take some time at the end of the hour to answer as many as we can. As the last item, we wanted to announce our next webinar, which will be on August 4th, 2020, on supply chain resiliency during COVID-19 and beyond. And a little bit about the panel. COVID-19, as you all know, has changed how business and society operate as a whole. More people are working from home, supply chains are being disrupted, and there is now a need for social distancing. Ensuring a safe workplace for all, where we meet COVID safety policies as well as meet project objectives, can be more challenging for construction than other industries. However, this will also provide an opportunity for emerging technologies to accelerate and address these challenges. That's the purpose of our panel today and what we will be discussing. And with that, I would like to announce our panelists. Jim Banaszak is an expert partner for major projects in the capital productivity and infrastructure practice at McKinsey & Company, and a member of the firm's global energy, materials, retail, and high-tech project delivery service lines. He received his degree in metallurgical engineering from Colorado School of Mines and has his PhD in civil and environmental engineering from Northwestern University. James Chu is Chief Technical Officer for Strategic Project Solutions. He has over 25 years of experience in research, development, and implementation of solutions for optimizing the delivery of complex and critical capital projects. James earned his PhD in construction engineering and management from the University of California at Berkeley. And David Parker is the Chief Evangelist for Cloudleaf and an automated supply chain expert. He has held various senior executive positions with companies such as IBM and SAP. And he has deep experience in supply chain management and supply chain management for the manufacturing, oil and gas, telecommunications, and pharmaceutical industries. He received his MBA from the University of Wolverhampton in the UK. And with that, we will get going into our panel presentation. We asked each of our three panelists these questions that you see on the screen in advance, so that we could gain a better understanding of their individual perspectives regarding how COVID-19 is impacting project delivery. And we will start with Jim. So Jim, what are you seeing out there? What do you see people doing to address these challenges? And what do you think the long-term implications are?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to PPI for inviting me to join this session. Super exciting opportunity to talk with all of you. As many of you might know, my firm McKinsey has been through several of our initiatives, including the Global Infrastructure Initiative, looking very hard at trying to pull together the collection of facts around what the virus is doing, what it means for various businesses, and for us on this call, what it means for construction. This information that I'm going to show you today is current as of June 1st. There is updated information. As a matter of fact, a new version came out this week. It's available on our website, so for those who are interested, you can look at the latest data. But just wanted to let you know the numbers you'll see here are about a month old and have been updated. Why don't we skip ahead? Go ahead, Kristen. Do I have control, or do you have it, right? First of all, the COVID crisis really, or endemic, is really a humanitarian crisis above and beyond everything else. Obviously, for those of us sitting here in an essential business such as construction, we are one of the industries that had to keep going no matter what. And I think the one major thing I want to kick off with is there's still a considerable amount of uncertainty out there about what's going to happen with the virus. That uncertainty is caused by several factors. First of all, we're learning every day more and more about the virus, how it's transmitted, what the impacts are in certain age groups, transmission inside versus outside. I think a lot of you are probably reading about that in the news. You're also aware that there are a variety of vaccines and treatments under development. Some are proving to be potentially quite successful, which is very exciting news. But nothing has been approved for the vaccine side. There are several approved medications for treatment, and more come in every day. Which is great news, but there's still considerable uncertainty about, full standard of care for all affected folks. As we see in the US and other parts of the world, the efficacy of public health measures is sometimes variable, right? So some states who were doing very well are now doing not so well. Others who were doing poorly in the beginning are doing pretty well now. That we don't expect to change at all. And then the government reaction to these issues that I just mentioned also is variable. So in different parts of the United States and other parts of the world, the regulations that are coming to our industry, we can expect to change over time. So, our view is that change is going to be with us for the next at least 6, if not up to 18 months. And that's really the basis of the work that we're doing to try to help our clients continue with projects. Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay.
I don't think I have to tell anyone on this call that the impact of the pandemic has been pretty harsh to our industry in certain sectors. But in other sectors, it actually has increased the amount of construction that's going on. Again, this is about month-old data, but basically when we took a look at the various sectors and what the pandemic meant for actual construction projects, you can see quite a bit of variability depending on which sector you're in. But at bottom line, we saw that there could be up to about a 30% decrease in the amount of capital that would be spent over the next year or so for current projects. However, governments are looking at stimulus funding for infrastructure projects or other types of projects that might actually help our industry partially recover from this. Bottom line is construction will continue to go on. There still is a lot of construction going on. There are a lot of projects that need to be completed. And as we know, a lot of projects that actually have to be completed on time, even though we potentially took a pause of a few months here due to the initial pandemic. Why don't we skip ahead, Kristen, please? I don't think it'll be any news to anyone on this call, but there will be a continuing number of challenges facing projects around the world. We talked about government. We talked about disruption of resources, including potentially getting workers to the site, getting other materials to the site, interactions with permitting agencies, etc. There is worry on the financial side about some of these projects and the business cases associated with the projects, and if the financiers actually want to continue to put money into a project where they're not positive about the investment outcome. Obviously, the general public behavior is changing based on what's happening, and this affects how we get our workers to the site. It affects who actually comes to the site, and it affects how folks actually work on the site when they get there. And I know my co-panelists are going to talk a lot about that. Certain projects did go into a pause, and that pause potentially created some issues with damage to works underway, having to do work over again, potentially missing equipment, damaged equipment. So there is a recovery phase. I think what we see is most of the projects are nearly out of that phase, but there still is a lot of recovery work to do from the further on downstream supply chain effects, and I know we'll talk about that later. At the time that this was written, there was a lot of talk about contractor and supplier bankruptcy. I think this is still a major risk. We haven't seen a lot of it yet due to some of the stimulus funding that did come in to the industry. But I think this is a watch out for a lot of the folks on this call to think about and just carefully monitor how everyone on your project teams, the extended project teams are doing from the contractor and supplier standpoint.
Right.
All that being said, Kristen, why don't we skip ahead? We see it coming down to three major issues, and I'll talk about the last one as my colleagues will talk about the first and second. But first, it's all about protecting the people that work on our projects, the people who are associated with their projects, and their families. Number one job for us is to make sure that everyone is safe on our sites. We are not transmitting the virus because folks are coming to work, and even as bad, having those folks who come to work potentially infect the folks that they love. Second, it's protecting the projects. I think we talked a little bit about that, but essentially what we've seen in talking to folks in the insurance part of the business, we've essentially seen a global force majeure, right? So there are impacts to projects. From what we've seen in the industry, most folks have been very collaborative in working their way through these impacts. And, it's been quite successful in coming together and actually pulling back some of the delays that were caused by the initial impacts of the virus. The third thing is protecting the performance of the project. And this is really where we get into what do we think is happening now? What do we see people doing? And potentially, what do we see for the future? So why don't we skip ahead one more, Kristen?
Oh.
Most of the folks are here because we're continuing projects. We're an essential business. A lot of us never stopped. A lot of us are still going to sites. A lot of us are still traveling. A lot of us are right in the middle of the fray. So we need to do that safely, and we need to learn new ways of working. That brings us to the second point on the left. The operating model for capital projects has changed. If you go to any construction site and walk in the trailer, you'll see that there's very few people there, right? Most of the folks who used to be sitting in trailers looking at the computer, potentially going out to the site, recording progress or whatever, coming back and actually entering that into a computer, are now sitting remotely. I actually just did a site visit tour for one of my clients completely remotely. So we had folks on the ground walking around with video camera, and we together looked at various parts of the projects. Digital is here to stay based on all this. And I think, the folks on this panel will talk a lot more about that. But we very quickly moved to a digital remote operating model for those folks that could do it. And that there's no going back. We'll talk about some of the implications of that a little bit later. If we look at the potential operating model, what we're seeing out there, we see, as I mentioned, we see a lot of folks working remotely, which creates a lot of bandwidth issues for engineers who have to open renderings on computers at home that don't work anymore, right? So if you think of that scenario, you now have a significant amount of data that used to be sitting on workstations in engineering offices that now have to be moved to the cloud so folks can access this from home on their laptops, right? Big change in how engineering gets done. Big change in supply chain. Supply chain now, I think we all realize how complicated they have become. We've had projects stop because the little circuit board that controls the pump, VFD, couldn't arrive from Asia. Everything else was there, but we couldn't get the card to actually control the thing, and has delayed projects significantly. Supply chains now have to be monitored down, almost to the piece part level. in order to predict what's going to happen on projects. And then construction, I know my colleagues will get into this a little bit or in depth. A lot more remote working, a lot more prefabrication and modular, a lot more visibility into what and how the work is getting done, and then complete transparency on the progress of the project. I think if I take a step back and just think about the context of all this, relating construction to other businesses, I'll just make 3 points and then hand it over to James. So as we talk to folks in our industry and leadership of other industries, 3 major trends are coming out of this crisis, and I think we as a construction industry, should talk about how they'll impact us. The first trend is you cannot communicate enough. As we, as an industry, typically got together in the trailer and talked about weekly progress and did our monthly report, those days are gone. It's instant transparency and daily, if not hourly, communication. I have client and project directors who are talking to the CEOs on their project every day. That never happened before. It's a new world. And I think that's caused by, a few things. As we opened up, we said there's a lot we know about the virus, but there's a lot that we don't know. That creates uncertainty for our folks. And what folks want to have is certainty. So we've had CEOs talk about doing 2-week communication plans, saying, look, we will not change your working environment without a 2-week warning. We'll create some type of certainty for you because we know you have situations at home that you have to deal with if you have to come back to the work site. So creating that communication pipeline is huge, and it's something that every CEO of a major company around the world is thinking about and is spending half their time on. I think the second one that I'll mention and we'll talk about more, I'm sure, is speed and agility.
Right.
If you think about vaccine development, it used to be a 6 to 7 year process. We are now testing vaccines in 6 months. That didn't happen because there, any single factor. There were multiple factors that created that opportunity. Number one is the third thing, which is digital data analytics. Second is talking with regulators and removing regulations that created issues or bottlenecks. And the third is just working in an agile fashion. Mm-hmm. I think how as an industry are we going to think about, shortening the durations of our projects? I'm not going to say by, several 100% as they did with vaccine development, but if they can do it, what is possible for us, right? And I think we're going to have a hard conversation about that. And the third is digital. I mentioned it, I can't mention it enough. Digital enhances communication, visibility, transparency, and collaboration on work sites. And the type of work that SBS and Cloudleaf do are exactly some of the essential types of technologies that we see are going to really help move our industry forward. So with that, I will stop here and turn it over to James.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Now, James, we're going to turn it over to you. James, what are you seeing out there, and what do you see people doing to address these challenges? And also, what do you think the long-term implications are?
Okay. Well, thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Jim, for that wonderful setup. So, in terms of what we're seeing out there, let's actually talk about, we're going to actually build on what Jim just talked about, the 3 different chunks, but we're going to actually term it a little bit differently. The first one is design and engineering. As you can see, you're experiencing, as Jim has pointed out, many of us actually many of the organizations have chosen to work remotely, work from home, and there's still a substantial amount of work getting done. It's got its own challenges, but that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it can be actually done remotely. However, if you actually go into your supply network, like a fabrication shops, logistical centers, warehouses, those really can't be done from home, nor can the construction itself, right? So working from home is not an option. So there are even more disruptiveness that's actually occurring in your supply and construction. Just recently, one of the local projects that we're actually involved in, we were told that the copper pipe was supposed to arrive on Monday, and it didn't. And so we said, okay, when's it coming? It's coming Tuesday, which was yesterday. Well, the pipes are here. However, one of the employees at that warehouse got tested positive, so the warehouse shut down, right? This is, so the material, you can't really get to the material again. So these are cases where we actually haven't seen in the past that's starting to occur. And we're actually hearing similar stories from others. Okay? And so we're going to actually focus a little bit more the conversation on the supply side and construct, and then see the implications on also the design and engineering as well. Okay? Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is very much based on what we're experiencing out here in California. I'm assuming that we actually have similar situations going around other states as well as other parts of the world. One of the things that we're seeing is it's changing and unclear and conflicting regulations. So it's not very often that we actually have in our personal lives actually talk to a friend who goes, can we go outside? Can we go out, eat outside? And then we go out and find out all the restaurants are shut down because as of this Monday, California is back in shelter-in-place mode. Okay. However, it's not just one agency that's actually putting out policies. We actually have in US, CDC, OSHA, California Public Health, and San Francisco Department of Public Health. So what we're finding is that the projects has to have an understanding and develop policies that's in line with all the public agencies that are releasing their new policies. Therefore, new regulations. Therefore, each project is adopting a different policy. So that actually creates a little bit of complexity. Okay? Right. Next one is about the actual workforce. The workforce that's actually on all aspects of construction wants to work. Right? I don't think that we haven't seen anyone that actually are trying to say, I'd rather stay at home at this point in time. Okay? However, as the research shows and the data shows, there's still a lot of people that are asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So we do know that some of the companies actually have chosen to adopt a survey, honor system survey, or even measure temperatures when they enter the project. But if you're asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, it's something that just is not possible to detect through temperature testing. Right. And also, when you do contact tracing of the employees that are exposed, what we're finding is they're actually getting exposed in personal time. So we actually recently had someone that heard about someone that actually went on a trip to Las Vegas during the weekend and then was exposed to the coronavirus once they actually got back. So even if we actually do a very good job on our projects, there are still potential exposures on their personal time. So that's something that we got to consider that as what we're seeing. Okay. The next one, please. However, the projects are, and Jim actually pointed out something that's interesting, is we never stop, right? However, the focus actually has been on critical projects and essential projects, but it's no longer critical and essential just as a society, but each company's projects are actually critical and essential to their survival. So as we actually hunker down or put a pause for a couple of months, we're finding out that's not a couple of months issue. And we're finding that it's going to be a lot longer term. So the projects are starting. Right now, there is nothing that's preventing any project, any construction projects actually from going. Okay. Also, there are limited government subsidies, which actually has supported some of the organizations over the last few months. However, that's not something that's going to exist for the next 18 months. So all the organizations that Jim pointed out that actually are that may actually go into bankruptcy or actually get in financial trouble, we need revenue. So it's something that the projects cannot repose again. That we're incorporating all the things that we just talked about in terms of how do we keep our people, project, and the businesses safe.
Mm-hmm.
So how are people starting to address that? Let's go take a look at that. So in terms of dealing with this environment, the framework that we've been using to assist our customers to deal with this situation is, in terms of design and engineering, better integrate and coordinate the knowledge work. Okay? And it's not, it doesn't actually stop at Zoom, GoToMeeting, webinars, Teams. Those are actually good meeting tools. But as you all know, engineering is not all about meetings. So we really need digital tools that can support collaboration, everyone working together rather than just virtual meetings and webinars. And although webinar technology is great, that's actually, it doesn't address the need of the teams. Okay? And in terms of physical work, the only thing that we do know that minimize the risk is we have to have less people come in contact with less people. So therefore, we have to find out how we can actually do more with less in terms of physical work. And in terms of the supply and the construction on site, those two actually have to be synchronized. When we actually say synchronized, we do not necessarily mean that one is 100% responding to other, but they actually have to respond to each other. Because as we just talked about the copper pipe example, the supply can be disrupted. At the same time, construction has to have certain work done in certain sequence. Therefore, those actually need to be synchronized. And I think that's a word that I think Jim actually already used as well. Yeah. Go to the next slide, please. So what does it actually mean to do more with less? Okay. It's a simple statement, but it's not something that's easy to actually adopt, right? So again, what we want to do by doing more or less, we want to minimize transmission risks by limiting the direct workforce on site. Again, however, when we say site actually does not mean the final installation area. It could be your fabrication shop. It could be your pre-assembly area. It could be your warehouse. And it could actually be your final installation. Okay. One of the other things that our certain customers are actually starting to do is to design the small units of groups that travel together. Okay. And I think the terminology that's actually being used is the pods. So pods are working together, and they can be a single discipline that's actually designated to the area, or as it matures in the project, it could actually become a cross-functional team that's actually moving in small groups. Now, one thing that's actually interesting about the pods are the design of the pods themselves, right? It's who belongs in which pod, and if we actually have to transition someone from a pod to a different functioning pod, what does it actually look like? Okay, so that's something that we need to actually think about. However, overall, what the projects are starting to do and the companies are starting to do is to re-examine what work needs to be done by whom, where, and how. Okay? The traditional boundaries of engineering, procurement, and construction is no longer the hard boundaries. As Jim pointed out, if we're going to actually do more prefab, however, if the prefabrications and pre-assemblies have the same issues as the site in terms of the installation as transmission risk, then that may actually mean having more suppliers rather than less, because you can't get the same amount of output from a single supplier. So your actually supply chain logistics becomes more complex, or it may become more complex. So one of the things that the companies are starting to do is look at the process as an end-to-end production system. Again, I won't go into the details here, but this is a sample production system of a raw material being fabricated, delivered, and actually being installed. What actually happens where is something that's actually starting to be re-looked at. And these are not just projects that are starting, but projects that are in flight as well. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? So people are starting to do this in two different ways. One is once you actually are trying to figure that out, the question becomes, how do you want our production system to behave? We can actually implement great tools to figure out, gain visibility into what it's doing, where things are at. They will go in more detail, but there are even tools and sensors that can track where people are at. But the real question becomes, where should those materials be? Where should those people be? And where should those tools be? Right? Unless we actually know what it should be, really, it's really hard to control against anything, right? And as we know, having a long-term, high-level schedule designed once and trying to follow it is not something that's even remotely possible at this point in time. So how do we actually have a system that's actually optimized, that sets the foundation on which you can actually control to? Once you actually have that, then the next is to actually, once you actually model and you have optimized to your current environment, the next one is to start controlling to that design. So Dave's going to talk more about the control aspects, so I won't go into the more details on how you can actually use IoT sensors to do that. But the relates, and then once you actually have a certain amount of control and a feedback and a data, then that needs to actually now being reincorporated into your model and optimized, so that you actually have a system that's actually behaving the way you want it to behave throughout the project. Okay. Next one, Kristen. So one of the big things that are actually starting to happen, not by choice, but out of necessity, that we think is going to stay, is one of the things that's been proposed over the last, let's say, 15 years, is a concept of a big room, Obeya, and collaboration by physically being in the room together. We actually seen buildings designed as such where there are no more rooms, there are no more columns, right? That are so that they can actually promote collaboration through co-location. Those are no longer possible, right? Some of the companies are already actually announcing that working remotely will be the standard way the company is going to be operating in the future. So what we're seeing is we're going to be starting to see distributed workforce supported by digital technology. It's not a collaboration amongst the distributed teams, but it's now getting to a collaboration amongst distributed people. Okay. So even if you actually have groups of 5, 6 people, it's going to be, again, there's distributed people supported by digital technology. So what we're seeing is the faster adoption of collaboration technologies beyond just the virtual meetings and presentations. Okay, again, those are great, but the question becomes, how do we actually work together rather than talk to each other or present to each other? The other ones that we're actually seeing, and this is something that we want to, I think has a huge implications for the future, is as people try to figure out how do we actually have less people interact with each other and have less people touch stuff, we're going to start seeing something we call intelligent production. Now, it's no secret, although not many people not realize, is even the hand tools that we're actually purchasing these days actually have IoT sensors built into them. Okay, so there's a proliferation of IoT sensors that's actually getting built into not only just the equipment, but at this point in time, and again, Dave's going to talk about a little bit more, the product itself. The question becomes, how do we actually bring it all together so that your production system is self-organizing and self-optimizing, right? However, again, as we talked about before, the premise actually has to be, we know how we want the production system to behave. So utilizing the foundational science called operations science and digital technology to build an intelligent production is something that I think we're going to see more and more come about. Okay. That's it, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Dave. David.
Thank you, James. That was great. David, on to you. And what are you seeing out there? What do you see people doing to address these challenges, and what do you think the long-term implications are?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, James. If you can go to the next slide, please, Kristen. So firstly, when we kind of look at the impact from the Cloudleaf lens of what we're seeing, there's kind of three core buckets, and again, it's not limited or restricted to these. But I'm sure we've all seen a lot of the press from various other industries outside of construction, oil and gas, where operational risk is a huge problem, right? In terms of how do you get workers back to work where there's human intervention required, particularly in the supply chain, around logistics, fulfillment centers. You've heard both Jim and James talk about the lack of visibility and understanding where various components or parts are, and the impact that has to your operations and your process and the ability to deliver. That's one of the big things that we see from the market today. And because of that, you've then got reputational risk, particularly if you're dealing in the retail or food and beverage industries, and specifically the pharmaceutical industries. A shutdown of your core facility where one of your employees or several of the employees have actually contracted the virus, and that gets out into the public domain. Now you've got a huge reputational risk that you have to try and salvage and prevent it from happening again. And then the other area around risk challenges is that of the legal side on compliance, and understanding what your risk mitigation plans would be on the failure to deliver products where they're needed, the failure to actually get construction delivered in the timelines that you previously agreed to, and being subjected to any legal claims for penalties, legal claims for breaches of service level agreements. So in the broad brush of things, these are the top three that come to mind when we canvass our customer base and talk to them about what are the challenges that COVID has actually presented them in today's current environment. Next slide, please, Kristen. And with that, obviously, when we look at the three pillars that I've just outlined, they try and look at what are the existing solutions that they can leverage today to overcome some of those challenges. However, the current options are very disruptive, difficult to manage. There's a change in your standard operating procedures, which in fact then actually just causes more risk to be applied in new risk areas, because you're getting infrequent snapshots of the data. You heard from James earlier that just capturing somebody's temperature isn't enough, particularly if they're being exposed to others that carry the symptoms in their personal life as opposed to bringing it onto their work site. Manual processes are hard to maintain and roll out, and they're inconsistent. You can imagine if you look at a job site that you've got one worker that's using the handheld temperature monitor, and he's monitoring each worker as they come on site. Who knows what they're contracting throughout the course of the day, and then and bringing that back with them the following day when that work starts. So you're not getting accurate data in real time when you need it. And of course, if you've got multiple sites and even a sub-supplier network that's feeding your multiple sites, you've got no single consolidated view. There's no single pane of glass that allows you to view what's happening in your supply chain today, and gives you some element of comfort that you know where your parts, components, materials are, and it's not going to impact your downstream or upstream processes. And of course, at the bottom one there, you'll see the risk of breached privacy, where you've got non-medical personnel doubling up as a medical personnel, taking health monitoring aspects, trying to assess you medically as to whether you're fit for work or fit for purpose, and you're not a qualified medical person. So we need to move away from that, and that obviously the way that you do that is obviously start looking at using technology to help you. Next slide, please, Kristen. So the rise of all of this, we know that obviously COVID has been around since the end of last year. It's been impacting many companies since the beginning of the year and really taken a foothold around the March timeframe. But even before that was occurring, there were two core themes that we were seeing, which is basically visibility and responsiveness across your supply chain. And I'm sure my other panelists will agree is that you have to have an element of how do you digitalize at the edge, and we'll call that virtualization for now. How do you turn a physical object into a virtual object by applying sensor technology to that specific component, object, or product, whether it's at a physical pipe or a welding machine, or whether it's a pallet level. How do you get that intelligence on the edge that allows you to not only virtualize it, but now start to visualize that in a real-time fashion? So you need data capturing at the edge from an electronic device. And then once you're capturing that data and being able to store that data, you can then assess the data that you're capturing. Again, all of this is in real time. So when I'm talking real time, I'm talking about being able to analyze hundreds of thousands of records, events in milliseconds, and being able to aggregate billions of events on the edge. And what typifies that type of process is the digitalization of e-commerce. If you look at the synergies there, or the parallels that we will see, where Amazon came into the fore many years ago and completely disrupted the supply chain. We've all gone from making an order online and expecting it to be delivered in a 7-day period to now expecting it to be delivered, if not within 24 hours, then within a few hours of you actually pressing the submit button on your mobile device to make some kind of a purchase. Well, that e-commerce world has now moved over to the normal commerce world of how we run businesses in oil and gas, construction, and other industries. You need to have that visibility at the lowest granular element of your sub-supplier network that feeds into things like what SPS provides in terms of your project management software, that gives you true visibility into how you're forecasting, and therefore enabling you to plan better your operational rollout and your building and your construction. So digitalization, and I think Jim touched on this at the very beginning, is becoming the cornerstone now of how companies are looking to transform themselves. We'd have heard of digital transformation many years ago, which was all around the industrial internet 4.0, where each individual component had its own inbuilt sensor. And many people were looking at that more for the industrial manufacturing type of industries. That was over 5 to 7 years ago. It's been gradually working its way into other industries, and obviously in light of the current issues with COVID, it's now rapidly accelerated the rate of adoption of that type of technology into other industries. Next slide, please, Kristen. So with that, what are we actually seeing now, and how people are trying to get around this? Well, firstly, again, James and Jim touched on this earlier. We're seeing organizations adopting technology, even down to wearing things like Fitbit devices on each individual worker. I think for those of you in the construction industry, you'll know for a while there's been a whole market around worker safety, putting devices on a worker's helmet or little devices they can wear on the vest on the job site that protects them from hazardous areas and also protects them from man and machine, that you're not getting into close proximity to operations of dangerous goods. Well, we're now leveraging a lot of that technology to collect and manage the biometrics of the human body, as an example. So we're very familiar with Fitbits that have been on the market for some time that will capture things like the steps that you do, they'll capture when you do your workouts. They've now evolved into capturing things like temperature, SpO2, your blood to oxygen levels. They're capturing your heart rate, they're capturing blood pressure, they're capturing your sleep patterns if you're wearing them overnight, things of that nature. So we've been working with a lot of the medical institutions, and more notably some of the neuroscience divisions of well-known universities to do early detection of symptoms. You heard James talk about symptomatic individuals and asymptomatic individuals. How can you understand if somebody's actually going to be ill before they know themselves they're going to be ill and before they're actually showing any signs or symptoms of an illness occurring? So this has been happening for many, many years in the neuroscience world, that your sleep patterns will determine your state of health. By wearing some kind of data capture device like a ring. I'm actually wearing an Oura ring here myself that's capturing my biometrics. That's being fed into a holistic database that our neuroscientists are using in certain universities. And from that, they're running AI and ML on that historical data from a sampling of 2,500 people grown to 7,000 people in the past 3 or 4 months of COVID. And with a 94% accuracy rate, they can predict whether somebody is about to be ill 4 days before they're actually showing any symptoms. Now that's pretty huge, and they've been doing this a lot in the Department of Defense area, particularly for the US Army, where it's been tried and tested for the past 2 years. Now they're actually applying some of those algorithms into the COVID disease. So that's why the testing is extremely important. So we can get some samples of who's been tested, who has the actual antibodies that can help others by looking at things like cell and gene therapy, and being able to allow organizations to detect who actually has the symptoms before they know about it and do predictive recovery processes, so they're not actually spreading that virus to others if they're coming into close proximity to others. Next slide, please, Christine. So this is, it's not new, but it's been addressed now even more so since the advent of COVID. So there are organizations out there, as I mentioned before, with Fitbits that allow you to capture the temperature in real time. So this isn't a human being standing at the front gate of an entrance to a work site and then manually checking your temperature. This is a wristband, Fitbit band that captures your temperature. There's a mobile device that has a mobile application on it that's constantly capturing that data. And this can be done anonymously. There's no need to actually capture personal information and store that. They can just take a unique ID from the individual, which could be an employee ID as an example, the unique ID of the wristband. They'll use a mobile device to capture the temperature and location, feed that into a central repository that's doing the analytics to determine whether your body temperature is aggressively rising, which gives cause to the fact that you're having some kind of temperature. And with that temperature, it leads to some kind of virus. The average body temperature is around 98.4 to 98.6 degrees in terms of your average body temperature. So if you're saying 1 degree above that, that's the leading indicator that you're maybe running a fever. So I may want to pull that individual out of the workforce. So capturing that information in real time, applying that to your business processes in real time, gives you some idea on how you can start to predict where your workforce should be and what impact could have on that, on the movement of your goods and products moving from point A to point B. You heard earlier James narrate a story that several pipes couldn't be moved because they'd hit the warehouse, but there was no staff in the warehouse because it's been shut down due to an employee contracting the virus, the COVID-19 virus. This is an early warning indicator of that, so you can continue the process flow of your product movement. Next slide, please. So that leads to kind of the supply chain of the future. And again, this isn't kind of new. We've all heard about smart cities. It then kind of transitioned over to smart hospitals in terms of medical devices, automation, robotics taking over, having the intelligence of them to do the work of what a normal human being would do. There are still some debates out in the market as to how accurate and how efficient they are, but it helps to alleviate the need to have a human there that could actually be exposed to some type of illness. So sensor technology is now enabling this. Small chipsets, small radio frequency channel movement of data that can be done with the next generation of 5G. We've all heard about that. 5G is actually going to enable these IoT devices to transmit data in a much higher frequency with a greater velocity of volume of data payload. That in itself will actually get onto things like smart highways as well, or smart vehicles. So for those of you that drive Teslas out there, they would argue that they're one of the first autonomous driving vehicles. But autonomous driving vehicles have been around for a very long time, particularly in construction, right? Around mining, you'd have seen Rio Tinto, tens of thousands of pounds of equipment moving around in an automated fashion. We're going to see more and more of that on the job site and on the construction site. And then equally so in smart factories, we see factory of the future evolving more and more. Less human intervention, more robotics. For those of you that have seen an Amazon warehouse or a fulfillment center, you can probably count on one hand how many warehouse staff are there within probably a 10,000 square foot radius. Most of it is automated, right in down to pallet movement and individual product movement. Next slide, please, Christian. So as we evolve from what we're seeing generically in terms of different industries, we're now seeing that apply itself to the construction site. You heard from Jim and James earlier about collaboration, right? We're seeing collaboration tools such as Slack being used more commonly now, not just between the constituents of a specific workforce, but the broader workforce, the sub-supplier network, broadcasting information to a general population that lets them know where the product is it going to be on time, is it going to arrive on time and in full, are there any damages occurring to that product that may cause me issues on completing the construction. I obviously can't install a faulty component and therefore I have to reorder. How can I get ahead of that and disseminate that information in a proactive fashion? So skilled labor workforce is going to increase as we get more into that distributed workforce that James spoke of. I think we are clearly in this world of the new norm. The changes that got put out 2 or 3 months ago are going to be here for a significant amount of time. They're not going to go away anytime soon. So we have to do that in a connected environment, both for people, machine, and process. So I think that's probably my last slide, Christine. You may want to go to the next one. I think that's my last one. So I'll probably end there and hand it back to you, given that we're approaching the time to get audience questions.
Thank you, David. Great presentation. We have a couple more minutes, and we're just going to quickly ask some questions of our panelists that were asked by the audience. So the first one was, how do you minimize human interaction during COVID-19 using technology such as automation and robotics? Let's start with Dave, since you went last and you also spoke on this. Any comments, Dave?
Yeah, I mentioned before about wearable devices, that they have to be somewhat seamless, if you will, in terms of how can you bring automation into play. Obviously, if you look at most of the factory operations, job site operations is all machinery led. So those machines are going to be more automated. You can actually We've all seen drones, right? So they're all going to be remote controlled, if you will, by somebody operating them from a safe distance, and they can operate many machines at the same time. So that minimizes the human intervention. But if a human has to be involved, how do you protect that human? So wearable devices, they're becoming very, very cheap. I actually have another wristband that I'm wearing today right now. You can see I'm all equipped up. My wife knows every second of the day that I move around. But this one was about $10, right? I'm not talking it needs to be aggressively expensive like your Apple Watch or Google Watch or so on Android. So the cost price of these things is dramatically decreasing, and the capability and functionality is dramatically increasing. So that makes it plausible to basically have one of these on every one of your employees and automatically start tracking them, tracking their biometrics if they opt in for it, right? So obviously there's a data privacy thing that we need to watch for. But those are the core things that we're seeing on how to give people the comfort and confidence that they can go back to work if they have to in a safe environment, or if they prefer to work remotely, then how do you help automation help them to do their jobs better?
Great, thank you. James, Jim, anything to add?
I'll just add a couple things, Kristen. One, I think we have to talk about factory construction. I know it's we really mainly see it in the residential sector right now, but at some point, those principles are going to spread to other industries, and I think it's just a thing that we have to watch and have to embrace. Because it's coming. The second technology I see that really can help with the current situation is whether you call it augmented visual reality, but it's really how can you have a subject matter expert sit wherever they sit and actually, to James' point earlier, do real-time work with the person who's actually installing or fixing or somehow setting up or commissioning a piece of kit on the work site. And that technology exists. It's here. It's being used. It's mainly being used in the maintenance side in many of our industries for the folks here on the phone. But I see that as something that might come and actually really explode in use very soon.
Great. Thank you. Our next question, how do we manage procurement and supply chain under current and near future COVID-19 conditions? Let's start with James on that one.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. One thing that we need to actually understand is, I think we touched up on it earlier, is you can't really actually segregate procurement and construction as two different aspects of the project. I think you actually have to start thinking about how do we actually look at the whole end-to-end process and start really thinking about, again, redesigning who needs to do what, when, where. That actually might now start to introduce new type of organization, new type of relationship with your supplier. But you actually have to have that. So traditionally, it's been a job of procurement to get material from supplier to the site. And once it was done, it was handed over to the site team to actually manage however they see fit. So there was actually, if you would, a barrier or a buffer of inventory that they were actually handing off. That actually has to become tighter coordinated, right? Again, hopefully it doesn't actually happen again, but should the site actually go into a pause, you don't want to be left with millions and hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars of equipment sitting out there that you actually have to now maintain in order to that. So when you come back again, you're actually now able to reutilize it, right? So again, that close relationship between the supply side and the installation side, I think, is critical. And then visibility, as David pointed out, and the control, it becomes a very critical element.
I think we have time for one more question. What changes have you seen that could become a new normal in the industry even after COVID-19 eases? Let's start with Jim on that one.
Yeah, I think I introduced with the concept, but there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on project teams, and that means there must be much more transparency between the teams and the executives. This crisis, I think, has shown a lot of executives for a variety of companies around the world that how important cash flow is and how a risk can really unmitigated come and really impact the projects in such a way that it impacts the cash flow of the entire company, right? So that means that the CFO will have more scrutiny on the portfolio projects. That means they'll be asking questions regularly. Where are you? You know, it's going to be okay to say, I have a supplier issue because of something that's happening. I'm not going to actually spend as much cash on my project as I thought. Let's use that in some other part of the business. And I think those conversations are going to start happening more and more across the industry and across sectors.
Great. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Jim, David, James, thank you so much. As a note, our next virtual conference topic will be on supply chain optimization and offshoring during COVID-19 and beyond, which will be held on Tuesday, August 4th. So be on the lookout for that invitation. And as a last note, if you are not already a PPI member, we encourage you to register at projectproduction.org. Our website has a lot of additional information and perspectives on how PPI is working to increase the value that engineering and construction provide to the economy and industry. And a recording of this panel will be available on our website shortly if you'd like to share this conversation with your colleagues. So thank you for attending. Thank you, panelists, for your valuable insights, and we hope you enjoyed.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.